Hello friends, in this video we are going to discuss about the service accounts in Kubernetes. So what are the service accounts in Kubernetes? These service accounts are non-human accounts which allows the API server to authenticate other processes or applications which want to connect to API server. For example, if any application which is running inside a pod wants to interact with the API server, then a service account can be assigned to that pod, and using that service account, the application which runs in the pod can authenticate with API server. These service accounts will be created in a namespace so that they can be assigned to the pods in a particular namespace. So if some application which is running inside a pod needs to access the API server, and if it needs to perform some actions on the cluster, the corresponding privileges will be assigned to roles or cluster roles in the Kubernetes cluster, and corresponding role or cluster role will be assigned to the service account. Once the role is assigned to the service account, then corresponding pod will be configured with the corresponding service account so that the application which runs in the pod will get all the required privileges. This way, the access to API server as well as the required privileges will be provided to applications which run in the pod via service accounts. So what are the use cases of these service accounts? We can use these service accounts in many applications wherever the applications which run in the pods to authenticate with API server. These service accounts will also help the pods to authenticate with the private image registries to download the required images. For example, the Docker images from Artifactory, Nexus, and so on. And these service accounts will allow applications like the CI/CD pipelines, for example Jenkins, to access the API server for automating the deployments, configurations, and so on in the cluster. So for example, if we have a Jenkins pipeline, so we'll run the Jenkins pod inside a namespace in the cluster. We'll create a service accounts for the CI/CD namespace, and we'll assign the service account in that namespace to the Jenkins pod, and we'll assign all the required privileges to the Jenkins service account via RBAC, so that the Jenkins application will have all the required privileges to create or update the required configurations in the cluster. So in that way, we can run the CI/CD pipelines to automate the deployments and configurations in the Kubernetes cluster. Similarly, for monitoring applications like Prometheus to collect metrics from the Kubernetes cluster, the Prometheus pod, which runs in the monitoring namespace, will authenticate with API server by using corresponding service account in the monitoring namespace, and also it will collect the required metrics from the Kubernetes cluster. These are just the two examples. There are many use cases of these service accounts wherever the applications or processes which interact with the API server, which need to be authenticated with the API server via service accounts. So in this video, we are going to see how to create the service accounts in Kubernetes cluster and how to provide the permissions to the service account via RBAC, and then how to configure a Kubernetes pod to use the service account. Finally, we'll test the connectivity from the pod to the API server by using corresponding service account. Let us perform all these tasks in the demo. This is a demo Kubernetes cluster. Let us see the namespaces in this cluster. So these are the namespaces available. For our demo, let us create a new namespace, for example CI/CD. The namespace is created. When we create a namespace, by default, Kubernetes will create a default service account in the namespace. So every namespace will have a default service account. So let us see the service accounts in this namespace. Here we can see there is a default service account in the CI/CD namespace. So if we create any pods in this namespace, by default, the default service token will be used by the pod to interact with the API server. So let us create an example pod in this namespace. Here we need to mention the namespace. So now we see a pod is created with name test. Now let us see if the default service account is being used by this test pod in this namespace CI/CD. So for that, let us describe the pod. Here we can see the service account is default, which is being used by the pod test under namespace CI/CD. By default, this service account will be mounted in a mount point. So from this location, the token will be used by the container to interact with the server. Now let us go inside the pod to see this mount point and corresponding directory contents. Here the pod name is test, so I am giving bash here. So we need to mention the namespace. Now we are inside the test pod of CI/CD namespace. So let us go to the directory. So under this we can see there is a token which is the service account token. Let us see the content here. So this token will be used by this pod to reach the API server. Now we have seen the default service account. Now let us create a custom service account and then we will try to use that service account in a test pod. So let us delete the test pod now. The pod is deleted. So let us create a new service account. We can use the declarative YAML file here or we can directly run the imperative commands. So let me run the command directly to create the service account. I have given the name as CI/CD/SA for the service account. So now the service account is created under CI/CD namespace. So now let us provide some permissions for this service account to list, create, update and delete the pods in the namespace. These are the example permissions I am giving. For that, let us create a role. I have given the name as CI/CD role. Now we need to provide the verbs. So we have provided all the verbs. So now we need to mention the resource. We are trying to list, create, update and delete the pods. So the resource is pods. And then we need to provide the namespace. So now we have created a new role under CI/CD namespace. So let us assign this role to the service account via role binding. We can use this command. So this is the name of the role binding. Now we need to provide the role. And finally we need to mention the service account. For this service account we need to mention the namespace as well. And then the name of the service account. Now let us provide the namespace. So now we have created the role binding so that the service account CI/CD/SA will get the permissions which are defined as part of the CI/CD role. Now let us create a new pod which will use the custom service account which we have created just now. So this is the new pod, my Nginx. Let us make it as Skyrun so that we can get the YAML file. Let us put this content in a test YAML. So let us open the YAML file now so that we can add the service account in this pod configuration. So in the pod configuration, under specification, we need to provide service account name. So here we need to provide CI/CD/SA. So let us save this configuration so that the pod will use this service account. Now the pod configuration is saved. Let us create the pod now. A new pod is created with name my Nginx. Now let us describe the pod to see the service account. So here we can see the service account is CI/CD/SA and the service account will also be mounted in the same location. So let us go inside the pod. Now we are inside the pod. Let us go to this mount point. So this is the token this pod is using to connect to the API server. So now let us verify the connectivity to the API server using this token as bearer token. So for that let us use curl command. Here we need to provide the cluster URL. So let us provide the API here. So now we need to provide the header which includes the token as bearer token. So here we need to mention the authorization. Here we need to mention this token. So let us provide the CSRT here. So let's execute this command. Here we got the response from the API server with API version as v1. Now let us try to list the pods from the API server using the similar curl command. Here we need to provide corresponding URL. Here the version of API is v1. Now we need to provide the namespaces. Our namespace is CI/CD. Let us list the pods here. So let us try to execute this command. So here we can see the response from the API server with pod list. So under this pod list we can see the name my Nginx which is running inside the namespace CI/CD. And these are all the details of this pod. Now let us try to list the pods under default namespace instead of CI/CD. Since this service account does not have permissions, we should not see any pods here and we should get the authorization issue. So let's execute this. So here we can see the pods is forbidden and the service account cannot list resource pods in the namespace default. So this is expected. So this is how we can configure a pod to use the service account so that the applications which run inside the pod will connect to the API server using the REST API provided by API server with the help of service account tokens as JSON Web Tokens. So in this video we have seen the basics of the service accounts in Kubernetes and their usage. We also have seen how to create the service accounts and how to provide the permissions via the RBAC to the service account, and then we have seen how to configure a Kubernetes pod with the service account, and finally we have verified the connectivity from the pods which use the service account tokens to the API server using the REST API provided by API server. These are the basics of service accounts. We can cover a lot more about service accounts in the future videos. I hope this video helps. Thanks a lot for watching.